Picture this. You crouch behind an overturned cannon on a frosted ridge outside the Belgian village of Waterloo. The date is June 18th, 1815. Mud sucks at your boots like hungry mouths. The smell of black powder and burnt horsehair sits thick in your throat, mixing with something else, the metallic tang of blood already spilled. Through the drifting smoke, you watch the Imperial Guard form their squares. Silent, perfect, doomed. These are the men who marched from Moscow to Madrid, who carried tricolor eagles across a dozen conquered capitals. Now they stand in perfect formation, blue coats dark with rain, muskets gleaming like silver teeth in the grey light. To your left, a small man on a grey horse scans the ridge with eyes that feel like a verdict being pronounced. Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, conqueror of Europe, master of a continent that once trembled at the sound of his name. He lifts a brass spyglass to his eye. He blinks once. The rain begins to fall. Sodden tricolors hang like funeral shrouds from shattered drums. A surgeon's bone saw glints wetly beside a pile of severed limbs. The steady drum of British volleys echoes across the muddy field like a funeral march played in double time. Each beat marks the death of an empire that once stretched from the Atlantic to the gates of Moscow. You can smell the fear now, sharp and sour beneath the gunpowder. It rises from the ranks of men who followed this small Corsican through the gates of Vienna, through the burning streets of Moscow, through the mountain passes of the Alps. Men who believed that speed was mercy and hesitation was death. Men who learned that following a genius could feel like flying, right up until you hit the ground. The grey horse shifts beneath its rider. Napoleon's jaw tightens. In 3 hours, the boy from a poor Corsican family will lose the most expensive gamble in European history and become immortal. Before we step into the smoke and witness the unmaking of an empire, consider subscribing to the channel and liking this video. This is the side of glory the monuments don't show, the mathematics of ambition, the price of being faster than time itself. But to understand why this muddy field in Belgium was always waiting for him, why this moment was inevitable as gravity, we have to start in a colder room. With a child who learned to conquer by calculating hunger, you sit shivering in a freezing dormitory at Brienne-le-Château Military School. The year is 1784. Your fingers are stained with ink, cramped from hours of copying mathematical equations by candlelight. Around you, the sons of French nobles mock your accent, your small stature, your foreign name. You are 9 years old, and you are learning the first law of survival. When every door is shut, you build your own. The map of Corsica pinned above your straw mattress is faded and torn, a reminder of the island home you left behind. Your father mortgaged everything to send you here, to this cold stone prison where French aristocrats' children learn the art of war. They speak of honor and blood, of ancient lineages and divine right. You speak of numbers, angles of fire, supply lines, the mathematics of victory. Your name is Napoleon Bonaparte, though you will soon learn to spell it in the French manner. You are an outsider among outsiders, a Corsican among Frenchmen, a scholarship boy among nobles, a calculator among dreamers. The other cadets call you the Little Corporal and laugh when you struggle with their rapid Parisian French. They do not yet understand that you are learning their language, but you are also learning their weaknesses. In the dim light of dawn, while your classmates sleep, you study the campaigns of Alexander the Great, of Julius Caesar, of Frederick the Great. You memorize not just their victories but their logistics. How many tons of grain does an army of 50,000 men consume in a week? How many horses die crossing the Alps in winter? How many cannons can a single bridge support? These are the questions that obsess you while other boys dream of glory. Your instructors notice your peculiar genius. You excel at mathematics and artillery, subjects that require precision rather than birthright. Geography becomes poetry in your hands. You see Europe not as a collection of kingdoms, but as a chessboard of rivers, mountains, and supply depots. History transforms into a manual of tactics, each battle a lesson in the fundamental equation that governs all warfare. Speed plus surprise equals victory. The military school is a monastery of violence, where boys are shaped into instruments of imperial will. You watch your classmates practice sword work and horsemanship while you calculate cannon trajectories and study maps by firelight. They learn the social graces of command, how to bow to superiors, how to inspire men with speeches about honor and France. You learn something more dangerous, how to make men follow you because you are always right. Your small hands trace supply routes across worn maps. Your young mind begins to grasp a terrible truth that will reshape the world. Modern war is not about courage or breeding. It is about administration. It is about moving men and materials faster than your enemy can react. It is about turning the machinery of state into an engine of conquest. The other cadets whisper that you are cold, calculating, friendless. They are correct. but they misunderstand what this means. You are not building friendships, you are building a philosophy. Every slight, every moment of isolation, every time you are forced to prove yourself through merit rather than birthright, adds another stone to the foundation of your future empire. At night, while snow falls outside the barracks windows, you write letters to your family in Corsica. Your handwriting is already precise, economical, authoritative. You tell them about your studies, about the weakness you observe in the French military system, about the opportunities you see emerging from the chaos that is beginning to consume the kingdom. France is coming apart at the seams. The old order built on blood and tradition is collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. Revolution is brewing in the streets of Paris, and you can smell it even here in your cold dormitory. The aristocrats who mock your accent do not yet realize that their world is ending, that merit will soon triumph over birth, that the future belongs to those who can calculate rather than those who can merely command. The first equation Napoleon solves is not tactical, it is social. How do you rise when every door is shut? You wait for a city to catch fire, and you sell the hose. You stand in the narrow streets of Paris on the 13th of Vendémiaire, year 4 of the Republic. The date in the old calendar would be October 5th, 1795. Church bells ring not to call the faithful to prayer, but to summon rebellion. Smoke drifts between the limestone buildings like ghosts of the old regime refusing to die. Your hands are black with gunpowder as you ram another charge down the throat of a brass cannon. Around you, the cobblestones are slick with blood and autumn rain. The air tastes of sulfur and revolution, of dreams dying and empires being born. 26-year-old Napoleon Bonaparte, now a general in the Revolutionary Army, watches through the smoke as 40,000 royalist insurgents surge toward the Tuileries Palace. The Directory, that fragile collection of politicians who govern what remains of revolutionary France, has made a desperate gamble. They have handed cannons to an ambitious young Corsican and told him to save the Republic. But Napoleon sees something else in this chaos, an opportunity to prove that artillery is the queen of battles, and that those who master her mathematics can reshape the world. The royalists come like a tide of white cockades and ancient grievances. They carry the banners of the old monarchy, the golden lilies of the Bourbons, the dreams of a France that was supposed to last forever. They fight for blood rights and divine appointment, for a world where birth matters more than bullets. They have numbers, passion, and the righteousness of men trying to reclaim their stolen inheritance. You watch Napoleon position his guns with the precision of a surgeon placing his instruments. He has studied the angles, calculated the distances, measured the width of the streets down to the last foot. This is not warfare, as the old nobles understood it, charges of heavy cavalry, the clash of sword on sword, honor decided by individual combat. This is something newer and more terrible, the industrialization of violence. A whiff of grapeshot, Napoleon will later call it, but you know better. This is not a whiff. This is a hurricane of metal that turns human bodies into scattered pieces, that transforms political theory into physics. Each cannon is loaded with canister shot, dozens of iron balls, packed into a tin cylinder that explodes from the gun's mouth like deadly hail. The order comes. The guns roar. The narrow streets of Paris become slaughterhouses as grapeshot tears through the ranks of charging royalists like a scythe through wheat. In 13 minutes, 40,000 rebels become a scattered mob. The sound echoes off the stone buildings, multiplying and amplifying until it seems the city itself is screaming. But something else is being born in that thunder. The Directory rewards those who can deliver victory quickly and cheaply. Speed is becoming more valuable than breeding, results more important than pedigree. The revolutionary meritocracy is learning to love its most efficient killers. Through the drifting smoke, Napoleon spots her, Josephine de Beauharnais, widow of a guillotined nobleman, survivor of the Terror, a woman who understands that in revolutionary France, today's hero can become tomorrow's corpse with a single change of political wind. She watches him command his guns with the cool assessment of someone who has learned to evaluate men as investments in her own survival. Their courtship will be conducted like a military campaign. She brings connections to the old aristocracy, a patina of legitimacy that a Corsican upstart desperately needs. He brings protection, advancement, and the promise of a future where being on the winning side matters more than being on the right side. It is not love, it is strategy wearing the mask of romance. The cannons fall silent. The streets empty except for the dead. Napoleon walks among the bodies with the satisfaction of a mathematician who has just solved a particularly elegant equation. He has learned the fundamental lesson that will carry him to the throne of Europe. In the modern world, power flows not from the blood in your veins, but from your ability to spill the blood of others more efficiently than they can spill yours. The Directory has just made the most expensive mistake in French history. They have given a genius his first taste of power. Now give that man an army and point him at a rich, complacent empire. You sprint alongside a mule train through the narrow passes of the Alps in the spring of 1796. Your boots are soaked through, splitting at the seams. The bread in your pack is 3 days old and hard as stone. Thunder echoes off the mountain walls, but you cannot tell if it comes from the storm clouds above or the Austrian cannons ahead. Around you, 30,000 men move like ghosts through the morning mist. The Army of Italy, Napoleon's first independent command. They have not been paid in months. Their uniforms are patched rags, their weapons rust-stained from alpine rain, but their eyes burn with something more dangerous than desperation. They burn with hunger, not just for food, though their stomachs gnaw at their ribs. They hunger for loot, for glory, for the chance to transform their misery into someone else's catastrophe. Napoleon has promised them that Italy is rich, that beyond these mountains lie cities fat with gold, filled with merchants and princes who have grown soft behind their ancient walls. The starving army of Italy is about to become a blade that will carve apart the map of Europe. Your first glimpse of the Italian plains takes your breath away. Below you spreads a landscape of vineyards and olive groves, of walled cities and fertile valleys that seem to glow in the Mediterranean sun. But Napoleon sees something else, a chessboard where every river is a defensive line, every city a supply depot, every road an avenue of advance. The Austrian and Piedmontese armies are scattered across this landscape like pieces of a puzzle that no one has bothered to assemble. They follow the old rules of 18th century warfare: methodical advances, formal sieges, winter quarters that respect the calendar more than strategic necessity. They do not yet understand that they are facing something entirely new. War as mathematics, violence as velocity. At Montenot, Napoleon strikes like lightning splitting a tree. He uses his interior position to defeat separated enemy forces before they can unite. The Austrians retreat in confusion, unable to comprehend how their carefully planned campaign has become a rout within days. But this is just the opening note of a symphony of destruction that will echo across the continent. Then comes Lodi, May 10th, 1796. A stone bridge across the Adda River, Austrian cannons commanding the crossing. What should be an impregnable position. You watch Napoleon himself help sight the French guns, his uniform coat singed by muzzle flash, his hands black with powder. When the French charge across the bridge through the smoke and thunder, Napoleon runs with them. This is where the myth begins. The moment when the calculating artillery officer transforms into something else, a leader who shares his soldiers' dangers, who proves that genius and courage can occupy the same small body. His men begin to call him Le Petit Caporal, the little corporal. But now the nickname carries affection rather than mockery. Yet even more revealing is Arcole, 3 months later. Another bridge, another seemingly impossible crossing. But this time Napoleon understands that war is theater as much as tactics. He grabs a tricolor flag and advances toward the Austrian guns, knowing that artists will paint this moment, that poets will sing of it, that the image of the small general with the flag will become more powerful than any actual military maneuver. The truth is more complex, more human. Napoleon's horse is shot from under him. He falls into a marsh and nearly drowns in 2 feet of muddy water. But what matters is not what happened. It is what people believe happened. He is learning the optics of victory, discovering that perception can be as decisive as cannon fire. Victory follows victory with machine-like precision. Rivoli, Mantua, dozens of smaller engagements that blur together into one continuous triumph. But Napoleon's true genius reveals itself not in the battles, but in what comes after. While his enemies count their dead, he is already counting their treasure. The machine begins to pay for itself. Looted gold from Italian cities flows back to Paris, buying political support from a directory that cares more about solvency than sovereignty. Satellite republics sprout across northern Italy, the Cispadane Republic, the Cisalpine Republic, puppet states that dance to French music while their treasuries drain into French coffers. Treaty follows treaty. Campo Formio redistributes the map of Europe like cards in a deck, with Napoleon as the dealer who always knows what cards remain to be played. Austria trades Venice for recognition of French conquests. The Holy Roman Empire begins its slow dissolution. Ancient bloodlines bow to modern logistics. But here is where Napoleon makes his first fatal error. though he will not recognize it for years. He wins by moving faster than news can travel. His enemies are always fighting the last battle while he plans the next three. But what happens when news learns to move as fast as he does? What happens when his enemies begin to adopt his methods, his speed, his mathematics of violence? He looks past Europe. He points at the sun. You step through the doorway of a plague house in Jaffa, March 17th, 1799. The stench hits you like a physical blow. Sour rot, human waste, the sweet corruption of flesh surrendering to disease. Flies swarm in black clouds around beds where men lie dying of bubonic plague, their bodies covered in the dark swellings that mark them for death. Behind you, artists wait with sketchbooks and paintbrushes. They have come to document this moment for posterity, to capture the scene that will become one of the most famous propaganda paintings in history. Napoleon touching the plague victims, fearless in the face of pestilence, proving his divine protection through his immunity to contagion. The reality is more calculated, more human, more desperate. Napoleon needs to visit these dying men not because he believes in his own myth, but because his army is coming apart at the seams. Thousands of miles from France, surrounded by hostile populations, his grand Oriental adventure is transforming into a slow-motion catastrophe. It began with such promise. The summer of 1798, when Napoleon sailed from Toulon with 38,000 men and a dream of Oriental conquest that would make Alexander the Great seem modest by comparison. He brought not just soldiers but scholars, engineers, mathematicians, linguists, archaeologists. This was to be conquest wedded to enlightenment, empire justified by the advancement of human knowledge. Standing before the Great Pyramid of Giza, Napoleon delivered words that would echo through history. Soldiers, from the tops of these pyramids, 40 centuries look down upon you. The moment was perfect theater. The young general of the French Republic, invoking the deep past to justify his ambitions for the future. The Battle of the Pyramids followed like a choreographed performance. Mamluk cavalry, magnificent in their silken steel, charged French squares with the same tactics their ancestors had used to defeat the Crusaders. But muskets and disciplined volleys proved superior to scimitars and individual courage. In an afternoon, Napoleon shattered a military caste that had ruled Egypt for centuries. Cairo fell. The scholars unpacked their instruments and began their work. The Rosetta Stone emerged from the ruins of ancient temples, carrying the key that would unlock hieroglyphic script and reveal the voice of pharaohs dead for millennia. Science and conquest marched hand in hand, each justifying the other, each making Napoleon appear as both conqueror and liberator. But empires are not built on single victories or scholarly discoveries. They require supply lines, reinforcements, the steady flow of men and materials that keeps armies alive in foreign lands. And on August 1st, 1798, Admiral Horatio Nelson found the French fleet anchored in Aboukir Bay and erased it from existence. The Battle of the Nile was not just a naval defeat, it was the severing of an umbilical cord. Suddenly, Napoleon's Army of the Orient became a stranded expeditionary force, cut off from home, dependent on local resources in a land that was beginning to see them not as liberators but as occupiers. The genius who had conquered Italy through speed and surprise was trapped by geography and the Royal Navy's mastery of the sea. The Syrian campaign that followed was Napoleon's first taste of genuine failure. Acre, defended by Ottoman forces stiffened by British naval support, proved impregnable despite months of siege. French soldiers died not just from enemy fire but from plague, dysentery, and the slow starvation that comes when supply lines stretch beyond breaking point. This brings you back to the plague house in Jaffa, where Napoleon walks among the dying with theatrical calm. He touches fevered foreheads, speaks gentle words to men whose bodies are already surrendering to death. The artists sketch frantically, capturing every detail of this calculated courage. Later, Baron Gros will transform these sketches into Bonaparte, visiting the plague victims of Jaffa, a masterpiece of propaganda that shows Napoleon as Christ-like healer, immune to disease through divine favor. The painting will hang in the Louvre and convince generations of viewers that their emperor possesses supernatural powers. But you know the truth. Napoleon touches these men because he has calculated the risks and determined that dramatic gesture outweighs medical danger. He understands that armies fight as much with morale as with muskets, and that a leader who shares his soldiers' perils can inspire loyalty that no amount of pay or plunder can purchase. The birth of the Napoleonic myth happens here, in this fetid room where reality and propaganda merge into something more powerful than either alone. Napoleon is learning that in the modern world, the story of victory can be more important than victory itself. that a general who controls his image can survive defeats that would destroy a conventional commander. He returns to France without his army, abandoning 30,000 men to their fate in the Egyptian desert. But he brings something more valuable than soldiers. He brings a legend, the tale of the Oriental conqueror who touched plague victims and emerged unscathed, who stood before the pyramids and claimed kinship with eternity. He returns to France without an army and takes a country instead. You stand in the morning fog at St. Cloud, November 10th, 1799. Dawn breaks grey and uncertain over the palace, where the Directory has moved the government, supposedly for safety but really for theatre. Inside the ornate chambers, legislators shout at each other with the desperate fury of men who know their world is ending but cannot agree on what should replace it. Steel flashes in the pale light as Napoleon's grenadiers fix bayonets. Their soot-smudged uniforms tell the story of their Egyptian campaign. Faded blue cloth bleached by desert sun, brass buttons tarnished by Mediterranean salt. These are men who have seen the pyramids, who have marched beside the Nile, who follow their general not from duty but from the deeper loyalty that comes from shared impossibilities. The coup that will remake Europe begins not with thunder but with whispers. Napoleon's brother Lucien, president of the Council of 500, has spent weeks planting rumors of Jacobin plots, of Austrian spies, of British gold corrupting French democracy. The legislators arrive at St. Cloud believing they face a national emergency. They do not yet realize they are the emergency. Napoleon enters the chamber wearing the careful mask of Republican virtue. He speaks of saving the Constitution, of protecting France from its enemies, of reluctantly accepting the burden of extraordinary authority. But his hands shake with nervous energy, and his prepared speech stumbles into confusion when hostile deputies begin shouting accusations. This is not the theatrical Napoleon of the Italian bridges or the Egyptian plague houses. This is a man improvising his way toward absolute power, discovering in real time whether his mixture of reputation and violence will prove sufficient to overthrow a government. The scene has an almost comic quality, the conqueror of Italy stammering before a room full of lawyers. Then comes the moment that changes everything. A deputy shouts, "Outlaw him!" The cry that condemned Robespierre to the guillotine 5 years earlier. The word hangs in the air like an executioner's blade, and Napoleon's face goes white with recognition of his mortal danger. But his soldiers know their cue. Grenadiers crash through the chamber doors with bayonets leveled. The deputies flee through windows and side doors, some still wearing their robes of office, others abandoning dignity for speed. The sovereignty of the French people literally jumps through palace windows to escape military force. By nightfall, the Directory is dead, and the consulate is born. Napoleon becomes first consul, technically equal with 2 colleagues but obviously superior in everything that matters. Popular support, military backing, and the brutal clarity of purpose that comes from having nothing left to lose. The genius of the coup lies not in its violence but in its legality. Napoleon wraps his seizure of power in constitutional language, in plebiscites and popular ratification, in the forms of democratic approval. The French people vote overwhelmingly to approve their new government, though the choices offered make clear that the alternative to Napoleon is chaos. This is the birth of modern authoritarianism, dictatorship that clothes itself in democratic legitimacy, absolute power that claims to serve popular will. Napoleon invents the political technology that will be copied by ambitious men for centuries, seize power through crisis, legitimize it through referendum, maintain it through a mixture of competence and fear. He has learned the most dangerous lesson in politics, that people will trade freedom for stability, democracy for effectiveness, representation for results. The coup of 18th Brumaire succeeds not because Napoleon is strongest, but because he alone offers certainty in a world that has grown exhausted by its own possibilities. Now he asks a harder question. How do you bottle chaos and sell it as order? You sit in a lamplit office in the Tuileries Palace as midnight approaches in 1803. Around you, clerks copy the final articles of the Code Civil with meticulous precision, their pens scratching across parchment like mechanical insects. Stamps slam down with rhythmic authority. Red wax seals cool and harden, each one marking another page in the legal foundation of modern Europe. Napoleon moves between the desks like a restless ghost, dictating corrections, demanding revisions, shaping with his voice the laws that will govern millions of lives. He has discovered something more intoxicating than military victory. The power to create reality through language, to build a society from words and will it into existence through the machinery of state. The Code Napoleon is more than legislation. It is the blueprint for modern civilization. Property rights, contract law, civil marriage, inheritance rules, the relationship between individual and state. In 2,300 articles, Napoleon constructs a legal architecture that will spread across continents, will be translated into dozens of languages, will shape legal systems from Louisiana to Japan. But the true revolution lies deeper than law. Napoleon is building the steel skeleton of the modern state. Centralized schools teach identical lessons from identical textbooks, creating citizens who think in compatible patterns. Prefects appointed from Paris govern distant provinces with uniform authority. A national bank controls currency and credit. Roads radiate from the capital like spokes from a wheel, carrying not just commerce but ideas, orders, the pulse of centralized power. He understands what the revolutionaries who came before him could not grasp, that liberty without order is chaos, but order without legitimacy is tyranny. His genius lies in creating a system that feels voluntary while remaining absolute, that celebrates merit while concentrating power, that promises equality while delivering hierarchy. The cult of merit becomes the new religion of France. Ancient nobility based on blood gives way to an aristocracy of achievement marshals who began as sergeants, ministers who rose from middle-class obscurity, a meritocracy that serves the emperor who created it. But merit, Napoleon learns, must be defined by those who reward it. Excellence becomes whatever serves the state. The press falls silent under the gentle pressure of censorship that calls itself guidance. Newspapers carry only approved news. Books require official permission. Even private letters pass through readers who judge their loyalty. But this is not the crude suppression of the terror. This is modern propaganda, the crafting of reality through the control of information. Image becomes more important than truth. Napoleon's portrait appears on coins and in public buildings, always showing him as he wishes to be remembered. The lawgiver, the patron of arts and sciences, the father of his people. Artists paint him crossing the Alps on a rearing charger, though he actually rode a sure-footed mule. What matters is not what happened, but what people believe happened. The coronation of December 2nd, 1804, represents the culmination of this transformation from republic to empire. In Notre Dame Cathedral, Pope Pius VII watches as Napoleon crowns himself Emperor of the French. The symbolism is perfect and terrifying. The church blesses but does not bestow. Tradition serves but does not command. The past legitimizes but does not limit. You witness the birth of a monarchy that pretends it is not a monarchy, an empire that claims to serve the people while demanding their absolute submission. The revolution has not been betrayed, it has been completed. Its radical energy channeled into the construction of a state more efficient than any king ever commanded. Napoleon's brothers become kings of satellite kingdoms. His marshals become dukes and princes. His court rivals Versailles in its splendor. But this is not the restoration of the old regime. This is something new and more dangerous. An aristocracy based not on ancient right, but on current usefulness. Not on inherited privilege, but on demonstrated loyalty to the system that creates and maintains their power. He has built a state like a clock, every gear precisely fitted, every spring carefully wound, the whole mechanism ticking with mechanical precision toward purposes that only its maker fully understands. Soldiers march in perfect step, bureaucrats process identical forms, students recite identical lessons. France becomes a machine for transforming individual will into collective power. But every clock hides a spring, and every spring, wound tight enough, will eventually break. Time to test it. 3 emperors, 1 field, 1 sun. Your breath forms white clouds in the frozen air of Moravian winter as you crouch on the Pratzen Heights. December 2nd, 1805. The thin sun struggles through grey clouds, casting pale shadows across fields that will soon be carpeted with the dead. Below you, the greatest military machine Europe has ever seen waits in perfect formation. 3 emperors command on this field. Francis of Austria, young and uncertain, heir to a 1,000-year-old dynasty that has ruled the Holy Roman Empire since Charlemagne. Alexander of Russia, handsome and idealistic, raised on Enlightenment philosophy and convinced that Napoleon represents everything evil about modern ambition. And Napoleon himself, barely 36 years old, master of France and Italy, the Corsican upstart who dares to call himself their equal. You watch Napoleon move among his soldiers in the pre-dawn darkness, speaking quietly to veterans who have followed him from the pyramids to the palaces of Vienna. His uniform is simple, deliberately modest, no gold braid, no elaborate decorations, just the grey overcoat that will become as famous as any crown. He carries himself with the calm assurance of a mathematician about to demonstrate a particularly elegant theorem. The Allied army outnumbers the French by 20,000 men. Their battle plan is methodical, professional, logical, exactly what Napoleon hopes for. They will advance against his weakened right flank, rolling up his line like a carpet while their center holds the commanding heights of Pratzen. It is the kind of plan that would have worked against any conventional opponent. But Napoleon has spent weeks preparing this theater, positioning his pieces like a chess grandmaster setting a trap. He has deliberately weakened his right wing, making it appear vulnerable, irresistible to enemy generals who think in terms of flanking maneuvers and tactical advantage. He has abandoned the Pratzen Heights, allowing the Allies to occupy the commanding position that every military manual says he should have held at all costs. The Allied columns begin their advance through the morning mist. 80,000 men moving in perfect order, their regimental colors bright against the gray sky, their officers confident that they are about to crush the French army in a single decisive blow. Russian Imperial Guards march beside Austrian Grenadiers, the combined might of two empires united against the revolutionary upstart. As the sun climbs toward its zenith, Napoleon springs his trap. Marshal Soult's corps erupts from concealed positions and storms up the Pratzen Heights, smashing through the weakened Allied center like a hammer through glass. The mathematical precision is breathtaking. While the enemy commits their strength against his deliberately weakened flanks, Napoleon strikes at the point they have left most vulnerable. The Battle of Austerlitz becomes a masterpiece of tactical geometry. French columns slice through Allied formations with clockwork precision. Artillery positions are overrun before their guns can turn to face new threats. What began as an orderly advance dissolves into chaos as units find themselves cut off, surrounded, destroyed by an enemy who seems to anticipate their every move. But perhaps the most famous moment of the battle never happened as legend claims. History records that French artillery fire broke the ice on frozen ponds, drowning hundreds of fleeing Russian soldiers. The image is perfect, poetic, the cold mathematics of Napoleon's genius, literally crushing his enemies beneath frozen water. Artists will paint this scene, poets will celebrate it. The story will become central to Napoleonic mythology. The truth is more prosaic. The ponds were shallow, the ice thin but not deep enough for mass drowning. Most Allied casualties came from conventional weapons, musket balls and bayonets, not drowning beneath broken ice. But the myth survives because it is beautiful, because it captures something essential about Napoleon's ability to turn nature itself into a weapon against his enemies. By evening, the Allied army has ceased to exist as a fighting force. 27,000 casualties, including some of the finest regiments in Europe. The Holy Roman Empire dissolves in a single afternoon. Austria sues for peace. Russia retreats to its distant borders. Napoleon stands master of continental Europe, his reputation elevated to something approaching divinity. But greatness has a parasite. It's called more. You stand in a Madrid square on May 2nd, 1808. A woman's scream cuts through the morning air like a blade through silk as French soldiers reload their muskets with mechanical precision. Around her, the cobblestones are already slick with Spanish blood. This is the Dos de Mayo, the 2nd of May uprising, and you are witnessing the birth of modern guerrilla warfare. The woman kneels beside the body of her son, a boy barely 16, his chest torn open by French bullets. He died throwing stones at Napoleon's veterans, his courage magnificent and utterly useless against professional soldiers armed with modern weapons. But his death will echo across Spain for years, inspiring a resistance that will drain French strength like a slow hemorrhage. Napoleon's empire has reached its zenith, stretching from the Baltic to the Mediterranean, from the Atlantic to the borders of Russia. But empires, like human bodies, can grow so large that their extremities begin to die from lack of circulation. And Napoleon faces a problem that all his mathematical genius cannot solve. Britain rules the sea. The Royal Navy patrols every ocean, intercepts every convoy, maintains the network of bases and allies that allows British gold to flow to Napoleon's enemies. Admiral Nelson may have died at Trafalgar, but his legacy lives in every British frigate that captures French merchant ships. In every convoy that carries British goods to markets Napoleon thought he had closed forever. The Continental System represents Napoleon's attempt to wage economic war on a scale never before attempted. If he cannot invade Britain, he will starve it. Every port from Hamburg to Naples is closed to British trade. Every European market is forbidden to British goods. It is an elegant solution to an impossible problem. Turn the entire continent into a weapon against the island nation that refuses to acknowledge French supremacy. But economic warfare requires absolute compliance, and absolute compliance requires constant enforcement. Portuguese merchants smuggle British goods through hidden networks. Russian nobles demand British luxury items, regardless of imperial decrees. Even French citizens grumble about the higher prices and inferior quality of continental substitutes for British products. Spain becomes the first crack in this perfect system. King Charles IV is weak, his son Ferdinand is ambitious, and both are willing to negotiate with Napoleon if the price is right. But the Spanish people prove less malleable than their rulers. When French armies march through their country to enforce the Continental System, Spanish peasants see not liberators but invaders. The uprising in Madrid spreads like wildfire across the peninsula. Spanish regulars are quickly defeated by Napoleon's veterans. But the war that follows is unlike anything the French have experienced. This is not the clean geometry of Austerlitz, with uniformed armies meeting on open fields under established rules. This is something uglier, more personal, more absolute. Spanish guerrillas strike from mountain hideouts, attack isolated garrisons, disappear into populations that shelter and support them. They torture captured French soldiers with creative brutality, mutilating bodies in ways designed to terrorize their enemies. The French respond with equal savagery, executing suspected collaborators, burning villages, conducting sweeps that turn entire provinces into deserts. Francisco Goya documents this nightmare in etchings that show war stripped of its glory, reduced to its essential horror. The disasters of war becomes a visual catalogue of what happens when civilized armies meet uncivilized resistance. Bodies hanging from trees, rape and pillage. The systematic dehumanization that occurs when both sides abandon the conventions that make warfare tolerable. Marshal Joachim Murat tries to govern Spain from Madrid, but his authority extends only as far as his soldiers can march in a single day. French convoys require heavy escorts to move between cities. Tax collectors need military protection to perform their duties. The occupation becomes a military drain that consumes men and resources without producing the wealth that previous conquests had generated. Napoleon commits 200,000 of his finest troops to the Spanish Ulcer, soldiers who might have been decisive on other battlefields. These men learn to fight a different kind of war, one where victory is measured not in territory captured, but in percentage of forces that survive each patrol. Their letters home speak not of glory and promotion, but of exhaustion, paranoia, the grinding stress of fighting an enemy that refuses to stand still and be defeated. The peninsula becomes a laboratory for the kind of warfare that will dominate the next 2 centuries. National resistance against foreign occupation, irregular forces battling professional armies, the mobilization of entire populations in defense of concepts like homeland and independence that transcend traditional dynastic loyalties. British gold and weapons flow to Spanish resistance groups through networks the Royal Navy maintains, despite French efforts to interdict them. Wellington lands in Portugal with a small but professional army that will grow into the instrument of Napoleon's eventual defeat. The Continental System begins to crack under the pressure of enforcement costs and popular resistance. You stand at the banks of the Niemen River on June 24, 1812, watching an ocean of boots cross into Russia. 600,000 men march in columns that stretch beyond the horizon, their uniforms perfect, their equipment gleaming, their confidence absolute. This is the Grande Armée, the largest military force Europe has ever assembled, and you are about to witness its destruction. The crossing takes 3 days. French veterans march beside Polish lancers, German allies beside Italian conscripts. A polyglot empire in arms that speaks a dozen languages but moves to a single drumbeat. Supply wagons carry enough food and ammunition for a short, decisive campaign. Napoleon has calculated everything: distances, consumption rates, enemy strength, the maximum time his enemies can delay before accepting battle. Everything except the one variable that will destroy them all: the Russian willingness to trade space for time. Tsar Alexander has learned from Austerlitz. He will not give Napoleon the decisive battle that French strategy requires. Instead, the Russian armies retreat into their endless interior, burning crops, driving away livestock, destroying anything that might feed the invading force. They transform their own country into a weapon, wielding emptiness and distance like artillery pieces. You march with the Grande Armée through a landscape that seems designed by a malevolent god. The roads are rivers of mud that suck at wagon wheels and horse hooves. The sun beats down with unexpected ferocity, turning steel breastplates into furnaces and woolen uniforms into instruments of torture. Men begin dropping from heat stroke before they have marched 100 miles. At Smolensk, Napoleon finally brings part of the Russian army to battle. The city burns for 3 days, its ancient walls crumbling under French artillery fire. But when the smoke clears, most of the Russian forces have escaped to fight another day. What should have been a decisive victory becomes another tactical success. that feels suspiciously like strategic failure. The red earth of Borodino offers the decisive battle Napoleon has sought since crossing the Niemen, September 7th, 1812. Prince Kutuzov finally turns to fight, deploying 120,000 Russians in defensive positions that bristle with earthworks and artillery. This will be the test of systems, French mobility and precision against Russian endurance and patriotic determination. The battle begins before dawn and rages until sunset. French columns smash against Russian redoubts like waves against granite cliffs. Bodies pile so thick around key positions that later ranks must climb over the corpses of earlier attacks. The sound of cannon fire echoes for miles across the Russian steppe, a thunder that seems to shake the earth itself. By evening, Napoleon technically holds the field. The Russians retreat in good order, leaving 45,000 casualties behind. But the French losses are almost as severe, and more importantly, the Russian army remains intact. What should have been the crushing blow that brings Alexander to terms becomes another bloody stalemate that advances Napoleon no closer to his political objectives. Moscow lies ahead, the ancient capital of the Tsars, the city whose capture should finally force Russian submission. Napoleon's scouts report that the population is fleeing, that Governor Rostopchin has ordered the removal of everything valuable. But surely some remnant remains, some symbolic victory that will justify the campaign's enormous costs. You enter Moscow with Napoleon's advance guard on September 14th. The city is silent, almost empty, like a vast theater after the audience has gone home. Magnificent palaces stand with their doors hanging open. Churches echo with the footsteps of French soldiers rather than Russian prayers. In the Kremlin, Napoleon sits on the throne of the Tsars and waits for surrender negotiations that never come. Then Moscow begins to burn. Whether from Russian sabotage or French carelessness, flames spread through the wooden districts with terrifying speed. The sky fills with ash and cinders. Ancient boyar mansions become torches that illuminate the night with apocalyptic light. Within days, 3/4 of the city has been reduced to charcoal and rubble. Napoleon waits in the ruins for 5 weeks, hoping that Alexander will finally negotiate, that some gesture of submission will transform this Pyrrhic victory into genuine triumph. But the silence from St. Petersburg is absolute. The Tsar will not treat with the man who has burned his ancient capital. Winter approaches with no political resolution in sight. October brings the first snow, light flakes that melt on contact but carry a promise of what is coming. Napoleon finally admits what his marshals have known for weeks. The campaign is over, the gamble has failed, the Grande Armée must retreat or face annihilation in the Russian winter. The retreat from Moscow becomes one of history's greatest catastrophes. You march through snow that deepens daily, that transforms familiar roads into white deserts where direction becomes meaningless. The temperature drops to 40 degrees below zero. Men's beards freeze to their chests. Horses collapse and are butchered immediately for meat that turns to ice before it can be cooked. Discipline collapses along with the supply system that kept the army functioning. Units disintegrate as soldiers abandon their weapons to lighten their loads, then abandon their equipment, then abandon their wounded comrades. The retreat becomes a rout, then a nightmare, then a form of slow suicide conducted on a scale that defies comprehension. The Berezina River crossing epitomizes the disaster. Russian forces hold both banks, the bridges are destroyed, and ice floes make fording impossible. Admiral Chichagov commands Russian forces that should be able to destroy what remains of Napoleon's army. But French engineers work for 3 days in freezing water to construct makeshift bridges from torn-up buildings and abandoned wagons. The crossing becomes a charnel house. Thousands of stragglers, camp followers, and wounded soldiers crowd onto bridges that sag under their weight and threaten to collapse at any moment. Russian artillery fires into the packed masses, each shot killing dozens. Bodies fall through the ice and disappear into black water. Women and children scream as they are trampled by men desperate to escape. Yet somehow, Napoleon and the core of his army escape the trap. Not through military genius, but through the kind of desperate improvisation that occurs when death becomes the only alternative to success. The emperor abandons his troops on December 5th, racing back to Paris in a sledge, while his soldiers continue their death march toward the Polish border. By the time the survivors reach safety, the Grande Armée has ceased to exist. Of the 600,000 men who crossed the Niemen in June, perhaps 30,000 remain in fighting condition. The rest are dead, captured, or scattered across the Russian wilderness like seeds that will never sprout. The machine that had paid for itself through continuous victory stops paying. It starts eating its builders. Europe smells blood. It comes with flags. You stand in the central square of Leipzig as church bells ring beneath cannon thunder. October 19th, 1813. The sound mingles into something that feels like the world-ending bronze bells calling souls to judgment, while artillery delivers the verdict. The largest battle in European history reaches its climax. This is the Battle of Nations, where 500,000 men wearing the uniforms of a dozen countries have come to decide Napoleon's fate. Russians march beside Prussians, beside Austrians, beside Swedes, a coalition united by nothing except their shared desire to destroy the Corsican who has humiliated them all. The mathematics that once favored Napoleon have reversed. Now his enemies outnumber him 2-1, and they have learned to fight as he taught them. French infantry forms squares against Cossack cavalry, while Prussian artillery pounds positions held by Polish lancers, fighting for a country that exists only on Napoleon's maps. The irony is devastating. Napoleon's former allies now use his tactics against him. His satellite states dissolve like sugar in rain. His empire comes apart at exactly the moment when he needs it most. Marshal Ney holds the center with desperate courage, but courage cannot multiply ammunition or resurrect the dead. French reserves that should be rushing to threatened sectors are trapped by blocked roads and broken bridges. The coordination that made Napoleon's earlier victories possible has degraded into chaos and improvisation. Then comes the moment that breaks everything. The Saxon troops defending a crucial sector suddenly turn their coats, literally reversing their uniforms to show Allied colors before opening fire on their former French allies. Betrayal spreads like plague through Napoleon's polyglot army as Germans remember they are German, Italians recall they are Italian, and only the French remain loyal to an emperor who has led them to disaster. The retreat becomes a rout. French artillery crews abandon their guns after spiking them. Supply wagons burn rather than fall into enemy hands. The bridge across the Elster River explodes too early, trapping thousands of French soldiers on the wrong side with nowhere to flee except into the guns of advancing coalitions. You watch men drown beneath imperial eagles, their bodies dragged down by the weight of uniforms they can no longer remove. The symbolism writes itself, Napoleon's empire literally sinking beneath the surface, pulled under by the very grandeur that once seemed to make it invincible. Within months, Allied armies are marching through the streets of Paris. The senators who once voted Napoleon absolute power now vote him into exile with equal unanimity. The empress flees with the imperial treasure. The marshals who conquered Europe calculate their odds of survival under new management. Napoleon abdicates on April 11th, 1814, in the same palace where he once crowned himself emperor. His signature on the abdication document is steady, authoritative, the handwriting of a man who remains convinced that his logic was sound even if his execution proved flawed. The Allies give him Elba, a toy kingdom where he can play emperor with a palace guard of 400 men and a navy consisting of a single brig. But as his ship approaches the island that will be his prison, Napoleon stands at the rail and stares across the Mediterranean toward France. The exile looks at the sea. He smiles. He bets again. You stand on a mountain road near Grenoble on March 7th, 1815, watching the most audacious gamble in political history unfold before your eyes. A small man in a grey overcoat walks alone toward a battalion of French soldiers, their muskets leveled at his chest. Behind him march just 800 supporters, the remnant of an empire that once ruled half the world. The soldiers wear the white cockade of the restored Bourbon monarchy. They have been ordered to arrest Napoleon Bonaparte as a traitor to King Louis XVIII, to end his desperate attempt to reclaim a throne that Europe has declared forever beyond his reach. Their captain raises his sword. The moment hangs like a blade suspended over history. Napoleon stops 10 paces from the leveled muskets. He opens his grey overcoat, exposing his chest to their aim. His voice carries clearly in the alpine air. Soldiers of the 5th Regiment, here is your emperor. If there is one among you who would kill his general, he may do so. Here I am. The silence stretches like a held breath. Then, one by one, the soldiers lower their weapons. They remove their white cockades and throw them in the mud. Officers who swore loyalty to the Bourbon king just minutes before now kneel in the dirt before the man they were sent to capture. Within hours, the battalion that came to arrest Napoleon is marching with him toward Paris. This scene repeats itself across France with mechanical precision. Marshal Ney, the bravest of the brave, promises King Louis he will bring Napoleon back to Paris in an iron cage. But when Ney finally encounters his former emperor, The reunion lasts exactly 5 minutes. The marshal who once conquered half of Europe for Napoleon cannot bring himself to destroy the man who made him a legend. France remembers glory more clearly than it remembers the price of glory. The veterans who survived Russia and Leipzig hear that their emperor has returned, and they abandon their plows, their shops, their attempts at peaceful civilian life. They flock to his banners like iron filings drawn to a magnet, bringing their scars and their memories and their unshakable faith that following Napoleon feels like flying. King Louis XVIII flees Paris so quickly he leaves his breakfast half-eaten on the palace table. The Bourbon Restoration, imposed by foreign bayonets and maintained by foreign gold, collapses like a house built on quicksand the moment its foundations are tested. After 25 years of revolution and war, France discovers it still knows only one name for greatness. But Europe has also learned from experience. The Congress of Vienna, which spent months arguing over the redivision of Napoleon's former empire, reaches unanimous agreement in minutes. The Corsican ogre must be destroyed permanently this time. No more exiles to comfortable islands, no more generous terms, no more opportunities for theatrical returns. 7 coalition armies begin marching toward France before Napoleon has been back in Paris for a week. The mathematics are brutal. Napoleon commands perhaps 200,000 men, many of them untrained conscripts and recalled veterans whose bodies remember Borodino and Leipzig more clearly than their minds remember Austerlitz. Against him marched nearly 1 million Allied soldiers, equipped with British gold and hardened by years of fighting the kind of war Napoleon taught them to wage. Yet for 100 days, the old magic seems to work. Napoleon reorganizes the French state with the efficiency of a man running out of time. New conscription laws, emergency taxes, diplomatic overtures to former enemies who might be willing to negotiate. The machine that once conquered Europe hums back to life, running on nostalgia and the desperate energy of men who know they are attempting the impossible. But the Allies are also operating on Napoleon's timeline now. They have learned that speed is mercy, that delay allows their enemy to consolidate his advantages. Marshal Blucher advances from the east with Prussian determination. Wellington lands in Belgium with British gold and Portuguese veterans who remember the peninsula. The net closes with mathematical precision around a France that has chosen legend over logic. Napoleon conducts one final review of his army on the Champ de Mars, the same field where revolutionary festivals once celebrated the death of kings. The soldiers who pass before him are younger than the men who stormed the pyramids, but their eyes hold the same fierce devotion that carried French eagles across a dozen capitals. They cheer him with voices that echo off Parisian stone like thunder promising storm. One last system check. Is speed still mercy? Can the emperor who revolutionized warfare 20 years ago revolutionize it again when revolution itself has grown old? It rains in Belgium. You crouch behind that same overturned cannon where this story began, watching the final act of the most expensive drama in European history. June 18th, 1815, the ridge at Mont Saint-Jean, Belgium. Rain has turned the battlefield into a marsh that sucks at horses' hooves and cannon wheels. Mud that will delay everything, upset every calculation, transform precision into improvisation. Napoleon stares across the valley through his brass telescope, studying Wellington's positions with the intensity of a chess master analyzing a crucial endgame. But something is wrong with the mathematics. The emperor, who once moved with the speed of lightning, now hesitates, calculating and recalculating variables that refuse to resolve into certainty. The late start costs him precious hours. Napoleon wants the ground to dry, the mud to harden enough for his artillery to move efficiently. But each hour of delay allows Blucher's Prussians to march closer from the east, transforms a battle against Wellington alone into a race against converging enemies. Time, which was once Napoleon's greatest weapon, has become his mortal enemy. Hougoumont becomes a furnace that consumes French strength. The ancient manor house and its walled gardens were supposed to be a simple tactical objective, cleared by a single brigade in an hour. Instead, it becomes a killing ground, where British guards hold stone walls against wave after wave of French attacks. Men die fighting for individual rooms, for garden gates, for a chapel where wounded soldiers pray while the building burns around them. You watch Marshal d'Erlon's corps advance in massive columns against Wellington's ridgeline. 15,000 men in perfect formation, their eagle standards glinting in brief sunshine, their drums beating the pas de charge that once terrified the armies of Europe. But Wellington's infantry waits in line rather than squares, their muskets loaded with the discipline learned through years of peninsular fighting. The British volleys rip through the French columns like scythes through wheat. Men who survived Austerlitz and Jena fall in windrows on Belgian mud. The survivors stumble backward through their own dead, the mathematical precision of their advance dissolved into chaos by the simple expedient of superior firepower applied at the crucial moment. La Haye-Saint falls to French determination and British ammunition shortages, but the victory comes too late to matter. Marshal Ney, the bravest of the brave, launches cavalry charge after cavalry charge against British squares that bend but do not break. Cuirassiers thunder up the muddy slope in perfect formation, their steel breastplates flashing like mirrors, their sabers bright with reflected light. But cavalry cannot break infantry squares supported by artillery, and Wellington's gunners have learned their trade in Spanish mountains and Portuguese valleys. French horsemen ride around the squares like waves around rocks, magnificent and useless. Their courage wasted against mathematics they cannot overcome. The afternoon stretches toward evening with the outcome balanced on a knife's edge. Napoleon commits his last reserve, the Imperial Guard, the men who have never retreated, who carried French eagles from Madrid to Moscow. These greybeards form columns with the mechanical precision of 20 years' experience, their bearskin caps marking them as the elite of an empire that once ruled half the world. Up the slope they march through smoke and sleet, past the wreckage of earlier attacks, toward the British positions that have held against everything France could throw at them. Wellington's army wavers, starts to fall back from the ridgeline. For a moment, it seems possible that Napoleon's final gamble might succeed, that genius and desperation might overcome numbers and position. Then Blücher arrives. Prussian columns emerge from the Bois de Paris like ghosts materializing from mist, their uniforms dark with mud and rain, their faces hard with the memory of Leipzig and the burning of their homeland. The emperor who taught Europe to fight has run out of time to apply his lessons. The Imperial Guard breaks. For the first time in their history, Napoleon's invincible veterans turn and run. The cry goes up across the battlefield. La Garde recule. The Guard retreats. The words spread like wildfire through the French ranks, carrying more destructive power than any British cannon. What began as an orderly retreat becomes a rout, then a stampede, then a nightmare of abandoned guns and scattered eagles. Napoleon himself flees the field, his imperial carriage overturned in a ditch, his personal effects scattered for British soldiers to loot. The man who once redistributed the thrones of Europe loses everything, including his dignity, in a single afternoon. Within days, Wellington and Blücher are marching toward Paris. The Chamber of Deputies, the same body that once voted Napoleon absolute power, now votes for his abdication. The Allies who forgave his first exile will not forgive his second attempt. The doors of France close behind him forever. A small man in a large hat asks a small island for a very long time. Wind claws at loose shutters in Longwood House as you sit beside Napoleon in his final exile. The year is 1820, and the Atlantic wind carries salt spray across the barren volcanic rock that has become the tomb of an empire. Your pen scratches across paper as the former emperor of the French dictates his version of history. But the ink keeps freezing in the nib. St. Helena is not Elba. This is not a comfortable retirement with toy soldiers and ceremonial guards. This is a prison 800 miles from the nearest land, where British warships patrol every horizon and British governors count every spoon. Napoleon Bonaparte, who once commanded 500,000 men at a single battle, now rules a household of 12 servants, under the watchful eye of guards, who treat him like a dangerous animal that might escape if not constantly monitored. Yet in this wind-swept isolation, Napoleon achieves his greatest victory, not over armies or nations, but over time itself. He dictates his memoirs with the same methodical precision he once applied to military campaigns, crafting a legend that will outlive all his enemies and most of his friends. Listen to him reshape reality with words. He was not a conqueror but a liberator, not a dictator but a lawgiver, not the destroyer of republics but their protector against the chaos of mob rule. The Continental System was not economic warfare but an attempt to bring peace to Europe. The invasion of Russia was not imperial overreach but defensive necessity. Every defeat becomes a strategic withdrawal, every retreat a tactical masterpiece frustrated by subordinates or weather. He transforms himself from emperor to victim, from conqueror to martyr, from the man who brought war to every corner of Europe to the champion of European unity. His enemies become tyrants, their victory a triumph of old corruption over new merit. The narrative is so compelling that even he begins to believe it. Meanwhile, his body decays with methodical precision. Stomach cancer eats away at the same flesh that once seemed immune to exhaustion, fear, or doubt. He grows pale and thin, his famous energy reduced to brief bursts between long periods of weakness. The man who once moved at the speed of thought now struggles to walk from his bedroom to his study. But the story grows stronger as its author grows weaker. Even his enemies begin borrowing his methods: centralized bureaucracies, merit-based promotion, legal codes based on the Napoleonic model. The monarchs who defeated him discover they cannot govern effectively without adopting the administrative innovations he pioneered. He dies on May 5, 1821, aged 51. His last words lost to history, but his legend just beginning to spread its wings. He dies. The legend wakes up hungry. Picture this one final time. You stand on that muddy ridge at Waterloo, watching the Imperial Guard fold their eagles like wings around a dying sun. The thunder of cannon fades into memory. The smoke drifts away on Belgian wind, and all that remains is the lesson written in blood across the fields of Europe. Napoleon Bonaparte was not a monster or a hero. He was an accelerant. He took the forces that were already reshaping Europe and fed them pure oxygen until they burned with terrifying brightness. The nationalism that began with the French Revolution, the bureaucratic efficiency that monarchs needed to survive modern war, the meritocracy that replaced aristocratic privilege with administrative competence, all of these existed before Napoleon. But he showed the world how to use them as weapons. He modernized states and then taught them how to burn faster. He created the tools that his enemies used to destroy him, wrote the manual that his conquerors used to govern their victories. Every European monarchy that survived the Napoleonic Wars did so by becoming more like Napoleon's France: centralized, efficient, ruthless in pursuit of state power, merit and myth, law and loot, order and ambition. Napoleon revealed these as two sides of the same coin he kept flipping until it came up tails. He promised that speed was mercy, that efficiency was justice, that power exercised with mathematical precision could create a better world. The price of that promise was 20 years of continent-wide warfare and millions of graves. The lesson is not, don't reach for greatness. The lesson is, know the price of speed. Every system that moves faster than its foundations can support will eventually collapse under the weight of its own velocity. Every empire that grows beyond its ability to communicate will fragment into the chaos it sought to control. He didn't lose to Wellington, he lost to time. And if you stayed this far, please subscribe to the channel and watch this video next about the most inbred man in European history.